wishing to be done missing.
This is going to be the subject of my next book. I'm going to write a style manual informed by modern cognitive science and linguistics. I call it a manual for the 21st century. So there are a number of techniques. One of them, the most important, is probably to have a theory of your reader and how the reader's state of mind differs from your own state of mind. The reason that it's so hard for academics to communicate is they've spent so many years in their field that they think about it abstractly. They think about the problems that they're obsessing over. They think about the difference between them and their academic peers. They find it obvious why you ask certain questions. They don't even bother to repeat the questions. And this is a flaw in human psychology that psychologists sometimes call egocentrism, or failure of theory of mind, that is your intuitive theory of other people's minds, that philosophers have called the curse of knowledge. That's my favorite term. Namely, once you know something, it's very, very difficult to imagine what it's like not to know it. Here's a simple example of the curse of knowledge. Take a 3-year-old child, give them a candy box, say of M&Ms. They open it up and there are pencils inside. And so they're surprised. You close it back up, and now Jimmy comes into the room, and you say, what does Jimmy think in the box? And the child will say, pencils. Now, Jimmy has no way of knowing that there are pencils in the box. And even if you ask the child, what did you think was in the box before you came in? They'll say, pencils. They can't undo their state of knowledge and imagine what it's like not to know what they currently know. Now, I think we're all like 3-year-olds in that regard, to one extent or another. And so part of writing is to go through the exercise of imagining what it's like not to know what you know, so that you start the story at the beginning, so you not only talk about ideas and research, but you explain why these are interesting questions to raise. So that's one thing. And one of the ways to do it is, before you try to publish something, you show it to someone who is not in your field, and you say, what do you think? Does this make sense? Is this interesting? And you get that kind of feedback. Another is more technical, is to think about how language works. And the big engineering problem that language solves is thoughts have a web-like structure. It's like the mind-wide web, I think of it, everything that we know, and everything's connected to everything else. But language is linear. There's one word after another. How do you map this tangled network of ideas onto a linear string? Now, language gives us an intermediate structure, a tree, where we group words into phrases, phrases into bigger phrases, but a tree still requires a left-to-right structure. And part of the challenge of writing is to coordinate these two demands. One of them is what idea is connected to what other idea. The other is, how do I linearize it? How do I tell a story where it makes sense to the reader that one thing occurs before something else? And that's at the macro level of organizing your whole story. The micro level, you still face that problem within each sentence. What do I put first? What do I put second? And what do I put last? So I'll just give you a concrete example, because to practice what I preach, people only understand things when they're concrete. So everything that I said, you're probably listening saying, oh, I think that makes sense. I think I understand it. But what the hell is he really talking about? So here's what I'm talking about. Say I write a chapter on language in the brain. There's this huge amount of research on language in the brain, from neuroimaging and patients with brain damage and aphasia, and genetic studies, and how do you organize it for the reader? If you're an academic, you think of the different academic fields. Well, there's neurolinguistics, and there's developmental psycholinguistics, and there's experimental psycholinguistics, which mean nothing to a reader. So I thought, well, how can I have a story that goes from a beginning to an end in a linear sequence that the reader will understand? And the way I did it was, and it's not the only way to do it, is zooming in from big to small. So I start off with, have the whole brain. Well, we know that the left hemisphere is more involved in language than the right. So the first thing I'll talk about is left hemisphere versus right hemisphere. Throw away half the brain. Then, within the left hemisphere, now I'll go to all the regions involved in language. That's kind of the Parasylvian region, like around there. So now I've narrowed it down. Then I'll go to Broca's area. That's part of the Parasylvian region, even smaller. Then I'll go to neural network models of language, from big areas of the brain to brain cells and their connections. Then I'll go to the genes and the genetic basis of language and language disorders. So I've taken you on a journey, almost as if I'm like that old Powers of 10 film from the Morrisons done here at MIT. Yes, which is also in the book. But that is a way of taking this whole body of knowledge and leading the reader in a logical sequence. Now, that's not the only way to do it. It could be historical, from the first discoveries to what happened in the subsequent decades up to the present. And that's another way to organize it. But you need some way to take this massive body of knowledge and turn it into a story, because we're a species that likes stories. Another way to do it is an argument. And you mentioned in the blank slate, when I talked about the theory of the blank slate, the theory of the noble savage, I put it in terms of an argument. Because we're interested in arguments. We're an argumentative species. That's a second or a third way of putting into some linear order ideas where everything is connected to everything else. And that's a challenge that every writer faces. One of them is to be a connoisseur of writing, that is, to be a good consumer. So if you pick up a book that you enjoy, or you come across a sentence and that really gives you pleasure, try to reverse engineer it. What is the writer doing that seems to be working well? That also gives you the pleasure of actually consuming good prose, good writing. Second would be, there are style manuals. I hope to write an even better one, but there are some very good ones. One of my favorites is Theodore Bernstein's book, The Careful Writer. Strunk and White's The Elements of Style is a very good one. There's one by Joseph Williams called Style. So the second one would be read stuff. Read advice. Read people who have tried to boil down the basic messages. A third is, you do need, like everything else, you need practice and feedback. Write something, show it to other people, see if they are getting it, see if they're enjoying it, find out what's hanging them up, get comments. And I still do that to this day. When I write a book, I will always send it to a mixture of peer experts who can criticize me if I've gotten the facts wrong, but also intelligent lay writers who can say, I'm sorry, I'm just not following you here, or this is really, really boring, and take their feedback into account. And related to that is simply put it aside and then come back to it yourself and rewrite after it's not fresh in your mind. Then your ego is not caught up in it. If you revise right after you write it, which I do, but it's not enough, then you often feel so invested in it. Oh, it's took me 3 weeks to write that chapter. I can't bear to delete whole paragraphs or to rethink it. It's too painful. You come back to it after 6 months. It's some other guy, the 2011 Pinker or the 2010 Pinker who wrote that. I don't care about him. If this is crummy, I'm going to have to rewrite it.
I can do better.
I can do better, exactly. It's usually a mixture. So the first thing I'll do is immerse myself in the literature on what I'm writing about. That is, try to read. Obviously, no one can read everything, but I keep reading until, especially if it's in some field that I've not been trained in. If I'm reading in philosophy or in linguistics or in history or political science, when I see the same names coming up again and again and again, then I feel, okay, now I've got a kind of grasp of the literature. Then I try to lay out both an intellectual argument and a narrative storyline. And usually I'll have to have that in place before I start to write. both for each chapter and for the book as a whole.
And do you write that down, or do you?
Yes, I write an outline.
Okay.
Usually. Sometimes, though, you got to give up your plan, either because you realize that the argument you're making doesn't work. You kind of argue your way into a corner and you know where to go. It's like, oh man, this can't be right. Or that so that happens. Also, what happens is the story just gets too complicated. It bogs down. You find yourself on a digression, and you realize I got to rethink the order in which I tell it. So you rearrange whole chunks and put in new connective tissue to plug it into a new narrative. That sometimes happens. So the answer is both, but I do start off with a plan.
Cool. I think that you enjoyed this part of the conversation the most. You know, like, very passionate about writing, and it shows.
That's because it's my next book, and writers are always most excited about the next book. In evolutionary biology, certainly Richard Dawkins is a gifted writer, and I've learned from him very much. In philosophy, Colin McGinn, Daniel Dennett are two superb writers. In political science and history, John Mueller has written books on the decline in war that both influenced me intellectually, but also are simply delightful to read. Let's see, among journalists, Matt Ridley has written books both on evolutionary psychology and on the improving state of the world, and on genetics, which are very lucidly written. So those are some examples. I have on my website actually a list of what I call good reading in violence. And I think it's not a coincidence that violence often brings out very good writing, even in academic studies of violence, maybe for the same reason that it does in literature and fiction. A lot of the great plays and great novels are about violence, war and murder mysteries, and it gets people's juices flowing. They get really interested in it. One other example is a book that just came out called The Great Big Book of Horrible Things by Matthew White, who's actually a librarian. Which is, I think, very good preparation for writing nonfiction, because you know what's out there in the literature. Anyway, Matthew White wrote this book of the 100 worst things that people have ever done to each other. All the massacres, wars, slaughters, genocides, but he writes about it in a very lively, lucid manner. Exactly, yes. And at multiple levels. I mean, first and foremost, just all of the facts. So I keep lots of notes. I do every possible medium. I write out notes in longhand. I have a lot of marginalia in my physical books. In my e-books, I'll have electronic annotations. I'll have electronic documents. I have every combination to offload my own memory, which is much too feeble to keep it in mind. And I'll have it that I can consult while writing. I'll also go over it before I put together my outline for that particular chapter or that section.
Keep on wishing to be done missing, but I guess this comes hand in hand with wanting it all. I need sleep, killed all the sheep.